We're recording on that. We're recording on that. Okay, folks. Thanks very much for coming out on a nice chilly evening. Without any further ado, I'll hand you over to Paul.
Okay. Hi there. Happy New Year to everybody, and thank you for coming tonight. Just a couple of things whilst we start. Don't forget we've got the caps now available with Neil. He will part with one in exchange for a £10 note. So those are available for anybody who wants it. If anybody wants one of the printed leaflets for 2024 for the club, which has got all the match dates on, then that's available there.
As well?
No, that's free. Also free is if you'll see I've printed off a few handouts kind of thing for tonight, but the actual file is on the Drake at Fly Fishers website. I've put it in a members section, so it's password protected. The password is Biggin123, capital B for Biggin. And if you want to download the PDF of that handout, it's on the website there. All of the match dates for next year are also updated on the website. I slightly modified some of the fishery instructions, and we're just waiting to see what is open in terms of bank fishing around the overflow and obviously Hensborough. Severn Trent haven't come back to us, but the most up-to-date information I have is the perimeter will be open hopefully from March, but it won't be open before that. There's still, as anybody who's been down like me, they still got the sign saying the perimeter is shut at Hensborough. So that's kind of update of what's been going on behind the scenes. So tonight, I thought it would be quite an interesting one to do a bit of a challenge to say how few flies can we actually get away with in the fly boxes, because if you're like me, every now and then you have to buy a new fly box because all the other ones are full, and eventually you start to think I need a bigger tackle box because the fly boxes don't fit in anymore. And it was very interesting for me to see how few flies I would actually need to catch fish in a season. And this last year there were 3 matches where I did quite well. There was the first evening match where I had 15. I had 8 in the last boat match of the season, and in that bright sunshine on the very last bank match day I managed 4 on that day. And if I restricted myself to the 20 flies in the list, my catch would only have reduced by 2 fish. I caught 2 fish on a tan daddy longlegs, foam daddy longlegs, which is not in the list. The orange one is in the list. And every other fish I caught in matches this last year are caught on flies out of that 20. So it really does show that if you stick to some of the core patterns and just focus on fishing them well, it doesn't handicap you that much. And the only kind of caveat I've got with that is that there are some days, particularly with buzzers, where I think sometimes the fish get a certain trigger from one thing or another about the fly, whether it's the colour of the rib, the colour of the cheeks, the size of the fly, the colour of the floss. There are some days where some flies will work and others just won't. And I think that particularly applies to buzzers. So I was going to have a little bit of a focus on some of the buzzers at a later part of the talk. So if I start with the 20, and you'll see that what I've produced is a short list and a long list. And the long list has got pretty much nearly 100 patterns on it. The short list has got 20. But when you look at the way in which certainly my fly box is arranged, often the theme of the fly stays pretty constant, but there might be 2 or 3 different versions of that fly based around certain fishing conditions. So the first fly that I'll go to is the one that probably is going to be on my cast on my first fishing trip of the season, probably either 2nd of February, something like that, which will be something black and green. Yeah, it is one of the absolute standard patterns that we will all use for certainly the first couple of months at the very least. And so you need a black and green pattern, and that was always going to be one of the 20. So the one that I've put there is my version of the Pitsford P, which I have tied in a previous demo. And this one, if you remember, has got not just a standard flat chenille body, but this one has got a pearl and black straggle body, which I think makes a huge difference to the attractiveness of the pattern. So this actually won me a match a couple of seasons ago when Thornton and Ibrook anglers fished Drake with us, and I had half my fish on that fly there. Okay, so black and green, but of course if you say, well, I've got that one for putting on a floating line with a bead on it, I also need one for sinking lines, maybe fishing closer to the bottom. If my second rod has got, say, a die 3 line on opening day, then that's the version of the fly that I'll probably put on, which, if you notice, it's a green butt rather than green front, and it doesn't show up on the screen quite so well, but I absolutely tell you that one, that green pearl lime green section there, when it's wet and it's in the water, that really does zing and acts as the target point for the fish. And some of you will remember at the start of, towards the start of this season, there was one of the very early weekends when there was a boat match, the 6x4 competition I think it was, at Draycote. And that day over 1,000 fish were caught on the one day. The average in the competition was something like 12 fish per angler on the boats. I was fishing the cornfield with this pattern on a fast intermediate line, and I had 16 fish on that day, fishing from the bank. So it was a really successful fly on that very same day, fishing just slightly up from where all the boats were. So that's the black and green theme that clearly you kind of just have to have as part of the set. You then obviously go to the other one, which is an absolute must, which is the cat's whisker. Yep. And my rule is, typically early season, if it's one of the usual dull days, relatively warmish, southwesterly wind, black and green works. If it's a much brighter day, colder conditions, then I might be tempted to put the cat's whisker on first. Yep, that's my little rule of thumb. Which one do you try first when the fish are just taking these lures? And that's the cat's whisker. The only extension to that in terms of if you extend your range of flies beyond the 20 is the one variation that I think is hugely successful is the gold arse cat's whisker. So you can see there it's got 1 and a bit turns of gold flash on the end of it, and there are some days when the fish will just absolutely hammer that and just ignore the straight pattern, and it's just one of those things. So that would be the other fly, the other cat's whisker that I have. At this point, it's probably worth noting that in all of these cases, if you get some kind of tail nipper targeting the tadpole style fly, then you can go to the dark side and use either a black and green, white and green snake, mini snake. And again, there are some days when they're nipping at the smaller fly, but they'll take the rear hook of the snake. They'll grab the end of it rather than grab the front of it. And so again, you end up with the black and green and white and green theme for these early lures. And all you're doing is changing the style of fly, changing the action of the fly slightly, changing where the hook is. but it's still the same theme. Okay, so the other main pattern that has just been absolutely immense for me the last couple of seasons is obviously the humongous, because I think the black and gold one in particular is great early season. The black and silver is actually pretty good early season as well. But of course the big change that I've made to my own flies over the last couple of years has been, instead of either gold bead chain eyes or black foam eyes, I've changed in both cases to either yellow or chartreuse eyes. The chartreuse beads or the yellow foam for the booby. And to me, again, that just absolutely enhances the pattern, that they'll ignore the one with the dark eyes or with just the flash, and as soon as you put the bit of colour in there, again, sometimes it'll transform your day. So that's the humongous, and of course in the list I've got the white and silver. I'll use this booby version here, the white and silver, because that certainly was in the early part of the fry bashing season, sort of October into November. That was by far my best fly. And there was one of the few days I fished on a boat. There was one day I had in perfect fishing conditions. About a quarter of the fish I caught that day were on the white and silver Huey. And it was a booby that I was using to prop up a washing line. Okay, so all of those humongous patterns, and again I do little mini snake versions of all of those, which work at various times, and again those have resulted in me winning some competitions. When the humongous doesn't work, but it's a bright day, this is one fly that I've tied before for the club as a demo, but really works well, and that's the black sparkler. So again, it's a great fly to put on the end of a washing line, because it really does draw the fish in. And again, there was one time when Stephen and I were in the pairs competition, and we did very well, and it was that fly that won us the match. And by the end of the match, I'd run out of copies. I'd been snapped a couple of times, and the one I'd got left had no wing, that had been bitten off, and there was just a bit of sparkle in the tail, and that was all that was left. But it was still catching fish. So those are the principal lures. The only kind of sort of major alteration to anything, this is not a fly I fish with very regularly, but I think some of the time you need some kind of just orange tadpole in your box if you're fishing lures. And I know there are some people I've fished with in the past years ago where they kind of just had these in the box and just stripped them in. And that was the sum total of what they did, because an orange tadpole is just such an effective fly at times, particularly when the weather warms up. So that's the only other particular lure that I would have. So that's just the set of lures. Then you come on to the nymphs, but actually the first one I need to mention, because is it a nymph or is it a lure? When you start to look at the hothead damsel, blue flash damsel, I don't actually think the damsels in either Draycote or Ibrook are particularly hot-headed. They're certainly not orange, but obviously again the orange bead head acts as a real trigger point. A little bit of blue flash in there as well. It does no harm and certainly does some good often. So there's one which is more nymph-like in the basic theme, but again acts as a lure if you need it to. So that's the one I've got there. And I do, in my extended collection, have a slightly different variation, which is much more of a standard drab pattern with bead chain eyes. there was one angler who was a member here years ago, and I think a former world champion, Jeremy Herman, who is still technically an honorary member of the club. He named a very similar pattern to this with just green body, green marabou tail. He called it the usual, because whenever he was fishing Dracus and he was catching fish, people would say, "What are you catching on, Jeremy?" And he'd go, "Oh, the usual." It was his fly. It was the fly that he used so much of the time. And I can remember him many, many years ago winning matches with just a very standard green tadpole type pattern. And the bead chain eyes in this case make quite a difference as well. I think they act as a nice trigger. Then we come on to some of the other nymphs. And the one I have to mention straight away is just the absolutely standard pheasant tail nymph. My record fish was caught on exactly this pattern. Stephen has had 2 absolute clonkers this season on the same fly. Yep, they were approaching double figures, weren't they? Both 10.5 pound, yeah. So, you know, you cannot ignore the pheasant tail as either a general pattern for when, say, sedge are coming off, or in I think Stephen's case, this time when there were pin fry this size around as well. And then the only other enhancement I've got for this is sometimes I fish with one with a silver thorax rather than the standard hare's ear thorax. And that's the other pheasant tail that I would use on a regular basis. And sometimes the silver thorax one outfishes this one. So there you've got the standard pheasant tail. The next one you have to kind of go to is some kind of hare's ear. And certainly not the last couple of seasons, but the 2 seasons before that, the back end of the season for me, I had so many fish on a size 14 dull back hare's ear. So just red game tail, red game hackle, scruffy hare's ear with a bit of a rib, and then if I fancied it, just a jungle cock cheek. And that caught me so many fish on so many days. It was an immense pattern, and it's a great pattern for when the shrimp are around. Now, there weren't as many shrimp, I don't think, this year as there have been some years, but you cannot ignore the presence of the shrimp. And certainly last season, I do remember early on in the season, I remember Lee Henfrey catching on hare's ear patterns off the Farborough Dam from a boat as the overwintered fish were still feeding on shrimp. So it's a really good pattern to have in the box.
Paul, can I just ask you a question?
Sure.
With regard to the pheasant tail, early season, how would you actually fish that?
Right, early season I probably wouldn't.
Right.
Because I would probably fish buzzers or the next fly I come on to, which is dullback.
Yeah.
The pheasant tail I start to use pretty much maybe mid-May is the first point I would start to think of using it.
Yeah.
When you might get an early spell of fry. And I think this year was actually very telling that because of the freaky weather that we had this year, I think there was some fry hatched out quite early, then there's a bit of a lag, bit of a gap, and then more fry appeared later on. That was my impression of what was going on. But the pheasant tail for me, some of its early catches are when the pin fry are around. So I'm starting to use the pheasant tail quite late. So mid-May and through. Now, because I fished the bank the overwhelming majority of the time, as I say, I fished about 3 times last year.
Yeah.
I think if I was fishing from a boat, I'll be using the pheasant tail more, but in particular, a fly that's not even on my list here, I'd be fishing a cruncher more as well. Because I think crunchers are very effective, particularly when you're boat fishing and you're fishing a washing line. So that would be, for those of you who fish boats more, I think the pheasant tail would probably come into it more.
Yeah.
But certainly, let me go on to the fly that I should talk about, which is the dullback. And this is just such an innocuous pattern. It's red game tail, red game collar, throat hackle, a very fine, this stuff, very fine red holographic tinsel rib, and a standard, this is not the right colour, but a standard peacock herl body. And the only change I've made to this fly, and it's very subtle here, is I might just shine a light on it and it might show up. But let's just see if this comes up. Can you see, as I'm shining that UV onto the fly, can you see it glowing now? Yeah. It's this stuff. Neon orange epoxy resin, 1 dot either side on the head. And there have been quite a few occasions where I've been fishing with anglers and we've all had dull backs on, and this has outfished everything just by that addition of those 2 eyes. And when I had caught 15 in the first evening match of the season, half of those fish were on that fly. Yeah. Neil, I think I gave you a copy, and then I think you caught on it as well. Stephen was too close to me to be given one of the flies. He was catching me up, so he didn't get one.
I know we were chatting.
Yeah, Stephen and Adrian. Yeah, but that has been an immense fly for me the last couple of seasons. I would say three or four seasons actually. That's certainly, if I'm not fishing buzzers early season, that's the fly I'm fishing with. There was one day, probably early May, this last year, when I'd been fishing the Old Pipe in Biggin, and I'd been catching on this there, but it was one of those really awkward southwesterly winds where you could, for a right-handed caster, you could just about get a line out. Then all of a sudden the wind picked up, it turned slightly further south, and it was just atrocious. So I had to move. I went round to Toft where one of the members was fishing, and he'd had a few fish early in the day, but by the time I got there, Toft itself was the colour of milky coffee. You know, it was just awful. I went right the way up to the Swan's Nest, where there was one little patch of clear water that hadn't muddied up. I chucked this fly out in absolutely crashing waves, and second cast I had a fish on that. And the guy comes up to me and he says, "What'd you catch that on?" And I showed him, and I'm not sure he believed me, that fly would take in such atrocious conditions. But even in the roughest conditions, in tricky water, that fly still worked.
So what team would you have?
Okay, yeah.
That formed by a team, presumably?
Yes, that's right. So what I would do, and I'll show you this now, the point fly that I would start with almost every time, that's a slightly hairy version of it, but I would almost always start with that fab on the point, which is competition pink or shocking pink fritz on the back. It's obviously got a pink piece of foam there, and I have actually brought it along with me. The front is the F&F Blushing Sunburst Fritz. That's the front of it, and although it wasn't quite as effective this last year as some years, that has been the best fab for the last 2 to 3 years. If you look at those 3 years as a whole.
So you'd have just a 2-fly setup?
So I'd have that on the point,
Yeah.
and then probably by the end of the day I'd have 2 of these on the droppers.
Right.
But what I would normally do is I would normally try and put 2 different flies on the droppers,
Yeah.
just to see what works.
Yeah.
And in fact, this year I did an experiment where I'd got this fly on the middle dropper, and I'd got one using the wider tinsel rib on the top dropper. So that was the only difference between those 2 flies, everything else identical. the top dropper fly never caught a fish. And I had about 8 on the middle dropper. And it's really astonishing how that one change, although you might say, well, were the droppers fishing different depths? But it was really, really interesting that I catch so many fewer fish with the wide rib. That's the fly in all the books, in all the magazines, in all the fly catalogues, uses the wider rib. That generally the first line I will normally fish with a washing line is the midge tip, simply because it automatically drags the leader under, and that's the one thing I really do want, is the leader to be completely submerged. But there will be occasions where I want the flies really high in the water, and under those circumstances I'll switch to the floater and just accept it. It does help if you're fishing more of a ripple to get the floating line and the leader to go under, but I will use a floater with the washing line. There will be occasions where I use the floater and I've got 2 fabs, one on each end and one nymph in the middle. And of course I've had some comedy moments when I've cast that into a shoal of stockies and had 3 fish hookups. But all in the surface, you can see all 3 flies being taken simultaneously. There was one occasion I was fishing the Swan's Nest, and one guy had caught a fish on a coral fab. So I put one of those on the point, a dial back on the dropper, and another coral fab on the top dropper, and I had 3 fish on. And by the time I'd finished playing the fish out, I'd got nothing on the end, no fly, nothing on the top dropper, no fly or fish, and I landed the fish on the dial back. But they were really, fishing really high in the water. So that's normally how I'd fish that. The other kind of general patterns that I would use, the one that I think is absolutely essential to have a few of in your box, and I do think sometimes it's absolutely brilliant, is a cormorant. Yeah, and there's various different styles of cormorant that I've used, but one of the absolute standard ones, which is almost the same as the dial back really, it's the peacock herl body, red rib, in this case black wing, and in this case I've got a jungle cock cheek on it. But that is just a fabulous little fly, and you can fish that on a washing line. And some days the movement of that wing, because obviously when you wet it, it almost looks like a buzzer body, and that's I think what they take it as, is a buzzer. And I often short dress this so that the actual body is more like a thorax. Yeah, that is a fabulous fly. Now, years ago, I used to tie one of these with a version of this, which is micro bright Vineyard, but they changed the colour, and it went from an absolutely deadly fly to an okay fly. So I still fish with them, I still catch sometimes on them, but it's not as effective as it was years ago. But particularly for beginners, I'll just see if I've got the material. Yeah, here we are. We are going to start to find it more difficult to get really decent peacock herl if we're not careful, because it's now CITES listed, so we can't import it anymore. So I'm always looking for subs for peacock herl, and this is one that I've tried, which is midge cactus chenille in peacock. And in fact, I've got the fly tied with it here. That's actually the cormorant tied with that midge cactus. Yep. And it is such a simple fly to tie. Basically, silk and 2 materials, the kind of mini fritz and the marabou, and that's it. I have put eyes on this, but that's a luxury. And again, I caught on that fly in one of the matches this season. That really tricky day, the last match of the season, I caught my first fish on that very fly. So just a simple fly that's so easy to tie, and yeah, just a really nice. Right. If that's a good question, the overwhelming majority of the time now, my go-to size for all of these wet fly or nymph type flies is a size 12. I hardly ever fish with a size 10, with the exception of the damsel, where I will go up to a 10. One of the flies that I'm going to be tying tonight, I will tie as a 10 tonight because it's easier to see, but I would much rather fish with a 12. And in some cases, particularly with buzzers, my go-to size is actually 14. So that's one thing I've kind of drifted to. When I was picking out flies for tonight to just show, I'd got 4 more size 10s in the box than anything else because I haven't used them up. Yeah, and I'm getting smaller and smaller and more tolerant of fishing small flies when conditions allow. Yeah, so size 12 very definitely is my go-to size, and that's a size 12.
They do say bigger fish take smaller flies, don't they?
Yeah.
Certainly on the river.
Yeah, yeah, and you know, as I was saying earlier, you know, if you even in a storm, if you're in the fish and they can see it, they will take it.
Which they can.
Yeah.
They can,
Yeah.
Great answer.
Yeah, and that's something, you know, particularly for beginners. You look at the 600 acres of Draycote and you think, how's the fish going to see that? But they will take that size of fly. Okay, last thing I'll just talk about is some of the dries, because I think that's been quite an interesting story for me this year. I think if I fish from a boat, I would fish dries much more often. And I love catching fish on dries. You know, seeing the take, it's just absolutely superb, isn't it? But of course, one of the real strange things has been the increase in popularity of these foam daddy longlegs, particularly the orange one. Now, all the daddy longlegs caught in the spider's webs at home, none of them are orange. And isn't it bizarre how the orange one seems to be so effective? But one of the points I'd make about all of the dry fly fishing that I've done this year is more than half the time, the flies I've been fishing with have, at least for part of the cast, not been fished static. Right? And that's something that I kind of learned years ago when I was fishing in Norway when wild trout were taking sedge off the top, and you would strip back either a muddler pattern or an elk hair caddis, something of that nature, and some of the sedges were big there. I was fishing with size 8 long shank muddlers, and fish were taking with sedges. But a moved dry fly is sometimes far more effective than a static. So with the foam daddy longlegs particularly, there was a few days where I was actually fishing 3 on a cast, tan, orange and yellow. Yeah, and you'd chuck that out. You'd fish static for a while, and then just as the boat got a bit closer, you'd start to drag and lift off. And how many times did you get fish take as the flies are starting to move? And the number of fish I missed because I was lifting off too quickly, because that's the instinct. And so some lovely days. And then to go along with that, one of the other dry flies that I had some real success with is obviously the one that we all know, but the big red. But one that was really successful for me, one of the few patterns I have actually bought, is the Davy McPhail big red. Yeah, which is this foam pattern here, fulling mill, and I've caught some lovely fish on that fly this year from a boat in a big ripple, but they were preferring that fly to the daddy longlegs much of the time. So I do recommend the big red, and that's one of my patterns. I think the last one that I'll just talk about before I tie a fly is it's any of a booby, a dry fly, or a pulled wet fly, which is a black hopper. Yeah, it can be taken as a hawthorn. It can be taken as a hatching midge, and I had 2 fish on that fly in 2 casts on the last match of the season. That won me the match. Yeah. So just something that simple. That one I put on as a top dropper to keep. I was keeping the flies high in the water, and they loved it coming through the surface, and they would take it often at speed as it was being dragged through the surface. So that's the other dry fly that I particularly like fishing with. Either as a static dry fly, the booby version, or the pulled version. And in fact, one of the...
Get a ripple or wave.
Yeah. But yeah, it can be a disturbance pattern. The thing that's really surprised me is there was a couple of times I fished with it before that match, and the fish were following it in. They were really intrigued by it, and I had a load of fish the trip before that match, where I was pulling the fly in, and then just feet from the bank, 15 feet from the bank, I would just lift the rod tip and make sure it was starting to speed up and then head for the surface. The number of fish that all of a sudden you just got an arm-wrenching take as they decided that they were going to have it after all. So, for such a simple pattern, this one has just got a very small holographic red tinsel butt on it, and the rest is just black seal's fur and so on. But a really simple and effective pattern. So you can see there that most of those flies are not unusual. Yep, they're readily available. I've put 1 or 2 slight tweaks on my own patterns, which sometimes make a difference. The Orange Daddy is the one I've just bought from the shop. I don't even bother tying that one because the Fulling Mill version is really good. But the next thing I should talk about is buzzers, and I'll tie a fly now. But what I've tended to find is I've tended to find that the fish can be quite picky when it comes to buzzers in terms of the size and the colour, and something as simple as the colour of the rib, the colour of the cheeks can make an enormous difference. But basically there are 3 patterns that catch the overwhelming majority of the fish that I take on buzzers. The first, which most people will know as a crisp packet buzzer, or Dorito packet buzzer, is just one where you take some kind of orangey coloured plastic from a crisp packet and use that as the cheek, black silk, and then a rib which is either silver tinsel, silver wire rather, or silver tinsel, something of that nature. I do one variation of it which is a red rib rather than the silver rib, and that makes a difference sometimes. But then the other one that I do, which is almost identical, is one which is basically the quill buzzer. So instead of a tinsel rib or a wire rib, you just use one of the stripped natural quills on the body instead. And certainly that fly this year was at least as good as the others in catching fish early in the season for me.
Paul, where do you stand on straight hook or grub hook?
Right. I always use, or I most of the time use a grub hook, and that's what I'll be tying tonight with. And in fact, I don't know if you saw the article on the Uphaven website where they did an experiment, and they tied the identical flies on straight hooks and grub hooks, and they fished simultaneously with those patterns. And the conclusion they came to with this experiment was that there was no difference in the hooking, in the attractiveness of the flies, that the person fishing with the straight hook hooked as many fish as the person fishing with the grub hook, but the person fishing with the barbless grub hook landed more than the person fishing with the barbless straight hook. Okay, so if I'm fishing barbless, particularly, I am most of the time, then I'm fishing with a grub hook, like this. Okay.
Well, if you see buzzers in the water coming up to the surface anyway, they're more often than not in a grub hook
Yeah.
in the body, because that's how they flex and move up through the surface. They don't swim in a straight body.
No, I've read an article which is the opposite.
Yeah.
I've read an article which was the opposite.
Yeah.
They're saying
Yep.
that if you look at buzzers, they in the water they're actually straight.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it depends on the direction they're travelling. I think when they kind of shoot, they sometimes just change height and change depth of water very quickly, and at that point they're straight. But then when they're kind of sinking back down, they tend to kind of curl up a bit. So that's why I think either works. The one thing that you will notice is with the grub hook, there is much more hook shank to tie a pattern on, which is why I find that fishing with a size 10 grub hook, the flies are too big. Which is why I would naturally migrate towards a size 14 as my go-to, maybe with size 12 under some circumstances. And if I'm fishing straight line buzzers, then I would, so I'm fishing 3 on a cast, I would normally go 12 on the point, either 12 or 14 on the middle dropper and a 14 on the top dropper. That would be my normal rig. So is it 12, 14, 14 or is it 12, 12, 14? That's usually what I'm fishing with the grub hooks. Okay? So I'll tie one and then we'll just pause for a moment. So this fly is one that I've not yet fished with, but when it was put out on the internet, on the Fly Fishing Large Reservoirs internet page, the fly tyer Garrick Eckhard got a whole load of abuse from his match fishing colleagues for leaking the fly pattern. And you can imagine, the sort of comments of what the F have you done telling everybody about this buzzer. Okay, so this is actually a really simple buzzer pattern to tie, but it just uses one unusual material. So like most of the buzzer patterns that I tie, I'm starting with the UTC 70 floss in black. That's absolutely the standard that most people would use. Some people would use a slightly thicker one if they're tying a really big buzzer. And all I do is take that to the end or towards the end, and in touching turns, so that I'm just building up the black part of the body. With a lot of the buzzers I tie, I would normally put a little red holographic tag on the buzzer, but this one doesn't have one. This instead has a simple rib of purple flat tinsel, and I'll show you the actual make. It is the Semperfly flat mirror tinsel, 0.4 millimeters in purple. And this fly is called the purple one. So I've just tied that in, and I'll take this as far back as I want, and then all I'm going to do is do more touching turns all the way up to the front of the fly again. One thing that I've just learned as I've tied a lot of buzzers is that if you're not careful, the part of the body where the shank of the hook is slightly straighter, the metal there tends to be just a little bit thinner and you don't notice. So I tend to just go back over that with the silk for a third or even sometimes fourth coat, just to make sure that the buzzer isn't thick at one end, then goes thinner in the middle, and then you have the head. So that is just the body, which is just those 2 to 3 layers of silk. And now, in even, fairly wide turns, all I do is do a rib on this with the flat tinsel. Okay, so that is the rib done. And again, you can see it's a relatively simple pattern to tie. And now I just start building up, and this is why some people use the UTC. I think it's about 140 thread instead of the 70, because the building up the head is quicker if you use a slightly thicker thread, but you end with a thicker body as well. And I'm just starting to build up the thorax here. Once I'm kind of happy with where the thorax is and I'm happy with the proportions, I'm going to put the wing case in, and that is basically one of the variables that you have with all of these patterns. And in this case, the suggested wing case is amber flexifloss. Okay, so that is the suggested wing bud. And one of the advantages of amber flexifloss that makes the pattern a little bit more kind of realistic is because it's got bulk to it compared with something like the sunburst goose bite that a lot of us would use as buzzer cheeks some of the time. This has got bulk to it, so it actually brings the fly out more 3D. The cheeks are more prominent, and it really influences the shape of the fly quite substantially. So I'm going to just build up that thorax a little bit. I've tied the flexifloss on the underside of the fly, and I'm now going to lock it in place on the upper end, on the top of the fly, so that the cheeks, as best I can, that's not worked fully, the cheeks as best I can go from top to bottom, or bottom to top on the fly. So they cover quite a bit of the thorax. Tighten that down to make sure that the flexifloss is bedded in. And then one of the advantages of flexifloss is if you pull it really tight, it goes quite small, and I can trim that off. And the only thing I've now got to do to kind of really complete the tying part of the fly is do the whip finish, which I do by hand, and that is pretty much the fly mostly done. Before I snip the silk, I'm just going to seal this in place so that the fly doesn't come undone when I snip it. So this is my Solares resin, and I've just done a little dab on that and shone the light on it, and that is now sealed. So that's now secure from a fly tying perspective. It's not going to immediately come undone. And now all I do is I add more resin to the whole of the body and thorax, and I just spread it about with a pin. Making sure that I coat all of the flexifloss. I'm going to need more of the resin on that. Yeah. Okay, so making sure all of that is coated round, keeping it smooth, Okay, so that's now completely soaked in. It's evenly coated, so I'm happy with that. And I'm now just going to shine the light on that. The option you now have is you could brush a coat of varnish over the top to absolutely make sure it keeps its gloss finish. But both the Solares and the Gulf Thinman resins that I use, if you let them cool down once you've shone the light on them, generally speaking, they do retain their gloss.
So what's the big secret, Paul? The purple or the amber?
The purple, yeah. And what I'll do is I'll pass a copy round. You can certainly have a close look at that. But when you start to see the light fall on it, when you see natural light fall on it, that purple really stands out. And the other thing that you might appreciate, this is kind of one of the scientific facts, is that if you're fishing a fly quite deep, purple is one of the colours that the fish still pick out deep. Yeah, purple and blue. You know, that end of the spectrum is what the fish spot. So I suspect that this fly is actually pretty good as a point fly when you're fishing buzzers deep. That's really what I'm expecting it to. Yeah, yeah. So that's just one example of a very simple buzzer that caused a fury when the pattern leaked out. Okay, how are we doing for time? Shall we pause there? Okay, so I'll pause there and I'll do one more pattern after a break. Okay.